After we rest up our bread dough and let it puff up majestically, what do? Smash it down with our fists and make it do it all over again. Now, I think I know why, at least in theory, but I've never put it to the test until now. Roll it! Hey home bakers, you'll know me by now and you'll know that I don't like to smash my dough back down with my fists. Instead, opting for a more loving approach, a delicate touch, but the aim of the game is the same. I'm degassing the dough before I shape it up and let it puff up all over again. But why though? I hear you ask. Can't we just shape it up straight after kneading it? Bread dough is long, man, and in this modern world I've got far more important things that need to be doing, like completing Netflix. Okay, I will try it, and a simple sandwich loaf dough is all that we need to test it. Here you'll see me making two doughs, not dissimilar to the recipe in my book, Bread Every Day, for people who want to eat bread every day. I mix them exactly the same, and I need them one in each hand like a total superhero. Yeah, I know. After kneading, I'm pop one in the bowl to puff up for an hour or so like usual, and the other I'm gonna shape up straight away. I'm delaying this part, you can see, because it goes against every single one of my instincts, but despite the feeling of unease that washes over me in the name of science, I will fight every organic tendency and force my reluctant hands to do it for you. Forgive me, my dough. Box on top, let's move on. Resting is what your dough is doing. Call it proving, call it proofing. I think I know the difference if I think on it for a while, but I'll just immediately forget anyway, so let's just call it resting. It's those periods where you leave your dough alone. And as home bakers, what we're doing here is giving our dough time. And over that time, three things happen. One, the dough puffs up. The yeast is doing its job and creating gas bubbles that inflates our bread dough over time. That's just what happens, and it's a signal to let us know that the second time around, after we shaped it, it's going to puff up again. If it puffed up once, it's going to puff up again. Two, flavour develops over time because of fermentation. The yeast is doing what it does, the dough ferments over time, and magical, delicious flavour arrives by itself over time. Isn't that wonderful? Yes. And three, strength develops. Whether you've kneaded your dough or you haven't, in this part where the dough is rested and just given time, the gluten develops even further just by sitting in the moisture. By the flour soaking up that moisture, the dough gets stronger over time. Strength develops. That's the third thing. Conditioning is what I've heard professional bakers call it. I think I could be wrong, but what I relate that to is what happens after you mix the dough ingredients together in the first place, between that point and the point where you shape it up, when it is ready to be shaped up. And we'll come back to this later. Ideally, when we rest our dough before baking, we want it to puff up as much as possible without it getting too weak and collapsing. After all, it will only puff up so far. This is how far loaf number one got before it became delicate. I tried to leave it as long as possible for maximum puff, but any further than this, and I'm beginning to worry we might actually lose it. You see me poking my fingers here? That dent ain't coming back. The dough is getting fragile. So I baked it at this point, and here it is after. Very little aroma, strangely enough, and that makes sense, but let's not peek too soon. For now, job done. We'll come back to it once it's cooled and move on to dough number two. After the hour or so rest it had in the bowl, just look how puffy it is. It's so lovely and light, and smell it, it's fragrant. This is something you can try at home after you've just mixed up your dough. Smell it then let it rest for an hour and smell it a second time. The first time you kind of get this kind of smell of flour and yeast, but not a lot else. The second time, you start to begin to realize what I mean by the development of flavor over time. It's a more complex aroma, intriguing and enticing. Yeah, it is. So then we degas our dough. Punch it if you want, bit weird. Or knock it back, whatever you want to call it. Taking our light and puffy dough back down to nothing again is the idea. Ready to puff up for that second time. For me, I opt for pre-shaping into a ball with a little rest and relax before the final shape. In class, I always say that this part might feel a little bit wrong. Getting rid of all that puff that has arrived so majestically, but then I go on to explain, it's just like gardening. A gardener trims back an overgrown bush ready for next season so it's able to flourish with more majesty when its time comes back around the following year. The gardener understands the value of the action and does what he or she needs to do to enable that bush to do what it needs to do to the best of its ability next time around. Joint effort. Stay with me. The gardener does it out of love, and so too do we. Think of it not as knocking out all the gas or punching down the dough, but instead a kind gesture that strengthens the dough we so lovingly created. Successfully shaping our bread dough is a joint effort too, partly down to us as the home baker and the actions we are able to perform with the power within our hands, and partly down to the nature of the dough itself. When rested properly, it makes it easy for us to perform those deliberate folds necessary to coax our dough into becoming the best it can be. Now, just for fun, let's travel back in time to see me once again awkwardly shape that first dough, this time watching with a keener eye. Here you can see me struggling, not only emotionally, but also with the nature of the dough itself. It has some strength to it, yes. It's been built by the kneading, but it's more Play-Doh than conditioned bread dough. I'm not sure I'm using that word correctly, so I won't use it again, lest another Bake with Jack roast video comes to light. The point is that without giving the dough that time, it's trickier to handle. Its lack of structure giving me little foundation to manipulate. Back to the present day, to our second dough now, and after I've re-strengthened the dough, punched it, knocked it back, whatever you want to call it, I've shaped it, I've puffed it, and look at this, it's ready to bake. Look at the size of it, it's massive. It's more than capable of puffing bigger, higher, taller, and prouder than the first dough while maintaining its strength. Watch as I press it and I prod it, and even though the volume is already way bigger, it has more strength and bounce than the first loaf. Let's bake it. The first thing I notice as this loaf is baking is the smell. Already the loaf filled the Bake with Jack studio kitchen with the moorishly appetizing aroma of proper bread. Where loaf 1 was a little lackluster in that department, this is the smell that draws you in. We can tell at a glance that loaf 1 is smaller than loaf number 2. That's obvious, but what might not be, that I hope you can see here, is that there's something about loaf number 2 that makes me want to eat it. That makes me go, wow, where loaf 1 made me say, ah, okay. And I suspect it's a combination of a lot of things. Yes, the size is larger, but also the shape is more satisfying. It has a plumpness and a roundness that is very, very pleasing, and more definition in its cuts. It's proud to be a loaf of bread, where the other looks like it feels a little ashamed of itself. It stands tall, while loaf 1 looks at his shoes, hoping not to be seen. It has a vibrant golden colour over the slightly dull hue of loaf number 1, and a sheen that's appetizingly enhanced. I can't help but feel sad for loaf number 1 at this point. Upon slicing, we can see with our eyeballs that loaf 1 has more inconsistent crumb structure, or more characterful bubbles, depending on how you look at things. But despite that, inside it's kind of dry and it breaks easily. Tasting loaf 1 made me go, and loaf 2, yeah, there's an improved flavour in the crumb of that twice rested loaf that is subtle to detect. But the crust, wow. That's where the flavour really shined. Not to mention its superiority in crispness too, where loaf 1 was kind of chewy. With this knowledge, we know that we can improve our yeasted bread just for leaving it alone for a bit longer. Letting time to do what it needs to do, developing the strength and flavour. You can extend things in that first rest by half an hour or even an hour, and your bread will be better for it. And yes, we're talking about yeasted bread dough here, but the principle is the same with sourdough. For what makes sourdough the most celebrated bread at the pinnacle of home baking is partly down to the specific bacteria, cultures and flavor profiles of the starter, but also, and probably more importantly, is that it is the bread that takes the most time to make. That's what brings the most complex flavor, the most pleasing of textures, and that essence of something that keeps us coming back for more. Time is a gift, and your bread will thank you for giving your dough a little bit extra to do what it's best at. Thanks for being here. I'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.